trying to get everything just right. And yeah, she's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for being here, Christine Agabi. So,
thank you for having me.
So just, I wrote down a little script. So if you'll give me a second, guys.
Sure.
So Christina Agabi is an AAPA accredited pre-doctoral internship at Ohio Psychology, over 15 years of experience in the topics of resilience and positive psychology, religion, and spirituality. And also among that is women's issues and diversity, both in clinical and in counseling. She has a master's and doctorate, graduate training in counseling psychology in Ohio, and taught various undergraduate and graduate psychology courses at 4 universities in the States. She also has a ton more going on, but unfortunately, I don't have all night to go through it all. Check out her website, where it's very easy to contact her in case you guys want to reach out to her yourself. And also it lists all the various myriad of things that she's done. I've had a chance to go over their website, and it truly is staggering. Again, thank you so much for being here, Christine.
Thank you for having me. All the way from East Coast, New Jersey, where it is a little bit warmer today, which is really nice. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it'll work. Hopefully everybody can see that.
Yes.
Okay. So I have to minimize everybody. So if you need to say something, I think just speak up, or we can keep the questions till the end. I have my website and my email address there if you need to reach me after the presentation. And today we're basically going to be talking about the pursuit of happiness from a spiritual and psychological perspective, and understanding the kind of fundamentals of positive psychology and resilience, which is really my area of interest and expertise, which is where I've done most of my work over the last 2 decades or so, and how this contributes to a meaningful and well life. So the purpose of today's talk is, obviously we're going to bring in a spiritual component and say what the Bible says about adversity, but we're going to look at how we can identify challenges in our lives and how these challenges may feel, and then see if we can figure out a pattern of how to meet those challenges through positive psychology and resilience, and through spiritual and psychological methods. So many times, especially over the last year, a little over a year now that we've been dealing with this pandemic, but even before the pandemic and even from day to day, many times we may feel like this, like we're carrying the weight of the world on our shoulders, and we don't know where to start and how to fix things and how to deal with the problems that come at us. And now with COVID, and I hear you all have a lot of lockdowns over there, the adversity may be even greater. And we've all experienced that over the last year, the shutdowns, things being, closed, and activities being closed down, and work from home. I've been working from home personally since March of 2020. So through that period, of course, there's going to be adversity, and at times it may feel overwhelming. But hopefully by the end of today, we'll feel a little more hopeful and figure out how to deal with those kinds of difficulties. I want to give a little bit of understanding first what stress is. We all say, I'm stressed, this is stressful, this kind of thing is stressful. But the definition of it really is the body's response to any demand that is placed on it that requires us to adjust in some way. So it could be exams, it could be work, it could be a lot of things that are piled up on top of each other. But it requires us to either adjust, and if we adjust, that's great, or we could react poorly and maladjust in some way, and that is a reaction of inappropriate ways towards that stressor. So breaking down and all those kinds of things. And stress can actually be beneficial, believe it or not. So in the green and yellow zone there, stress can actually be beneficial. It can help motivate you or keep you focused. Think if you have a deadline for work or for school or for whatever you're doing, that'll get you motivated. The stress of that will get you motivated to get you to focus on getting that work done, getting the research done, getting the project done. And it's actually kind of a healthy kind of tension. But if it gets overwhelming, if that stress gets overwhelming, now you're facing that orange to red zone. Hopefully you're not getting all the way to red, but that's when you may feel burnout, like you don't want to do anything. The stress is too much. You're exhausted. You're panicked. You don't know what to do. And that can actually lead to disease. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So you don't want to get into the red an orange zone. You want to stay in that yellow-green zone for stress to be beneficial. So stress comes from all kinds of things. Like I said, being overwhelmed with work, relationship issues, money issues, day-to-day things like traffic, all kinds of stuff can cause our stress levels to go up. And so, again, it can come from an overworked schedule, too much schooling, running late all the time, financial issues, too many responsibilities, not enough free time, traffic, technology, relationship issues, not enough vacation time, being cooped up at home during COVID, a lot of causes for stress. And there's bodily signs of stress that we can figure out how we're stressed from these things, from bodily signs, from feeling signs, from behavioral signs, and from thinking signs. And here are some examples of those. I won't read all of them to you, but again, if you're feeling foggy, if your thoughts are racing, if your heart's racing, if your thinking is fuzzy, if you're sleeping too much or too little, if you're eating too much or too little, those are all signs that something could be stressful, something could be going wrong. And that distorts the messages in our mind. We may show people on the outside, like this picture here on the left, that we're doing great, everything is wonderful, but on the inside we're crumbling. Or we could distort messages to tell us that we're broken, that we're unwanted, that we're unimportant, that we're shameful. And so stress can create a lot of problems if we don't keep it in check. And also when people are stressed, they create a lot of stigma. And stigma prevents us from getting help and prevents us from reaching out to other people. So we want to minimize the stigma that we put on ourselves and on other people. The word stigma, I believe it comes from a Greek word, which means like the mark of disgrace associated with a quality of a person. So a person starts to believe that they truly are shameful or unworthy. Of course, that's not true, but the thoughts in our mind become really negative and instead of positive. So again, hopefully by the end of today, we'll figure out how to deal with those things. So again, stigma comes from a Greek word saying it's kind of like a stain on us. But these things lead to a lack of us obtaining help. It leads to a shameful kind of experience where we feel unworthy. It leads to a lack of coping skills, feeling ostracized from others that we may love or care about, having a lack of understanding of what's happening to us. A lack of research is put into these areas because now people are not getting the help that they need. There's a lack of recovery and a lot of judgment, both from the person to themselves and from other people to that person. So we want to stress here that mental distress is not a sin. It is not a lack of faith. It is not a weakness. It isn't a separation from God. And it's not something that you can just snap out of by saying, okay, I'm not going to be depressed or sad anymore. Mental distress is a real problem and can be treated with the right things. And we'll talk about that as we go on as well. So again, 7 signs of things that can tell you if you need help: a change in feelings, a loss of interest, a change in sleeping habits or eating habits, uncontrollable emotions where you may be crying too much or unable to get out of bed or very low energy. These are kind of signs that tell you that there's something wrong. And usually our benchmark is about 2 weeks. So if these signs and symptoms have gone on for more than 2 weeks, it's time to get some help and talk to somebody about them. And when I see clients across the spectrum. I see them all the way at the unwell stage, but more than likely people are usually in the green to orange zone, and they really need some help to cope with certain things that have come up, especially now with COVID. So people can come in when they're really healthy or really unwell. And in either scenario, we give them coping skills and coping tools to cope with whatever they're going with. Another way to tell if there's a problem is if the frequency of that problem or the symptoms, the frequency of them has increased, if the intensity of them has increased, and if the duration of those symptoms have increased as well. If somebody has started to isolate and withdraw from family and friends, or they started acting out, or they started using substances more, or their behavior is erratic. And again, if there's cumulative difficulties in their life, and add COVID on top of it, of course, that is a signal that something could be wrong, and we need to address those issues as soon as possible. And so I just want to address a couple more slides about some of the most common mental disorders before we address how to fix some of these things with positive psychology. But any mental disorders, anything that is marked by kind of disorganization of personality, of their mind, of their thinking, or of their emotions. The most common two are probably depression and anxiety. But again, everybody gets depressed, everybody gets anxious. If you have a big meeting coming up or a big exam coming up, of course you might be a little bit depressed or a little bit anxious. But if you can't just snap out of it, then that's when it becomes a disorder that you need to have looked at. And again, it's not a sign of weakness or a spiritual flaw or a problem with you. And it's not something that you can just try harder to get better at it. This is a condition that needs to be addressed by a professional. So the statistics in the States are about 1 in 5 people have some sort of mental health issue. But for depression, it says that about 121 million people worldwide have that. And depression, again, is marked by sadness, inactivity. Again, it's gone on for at least 2 weeks without any kind of relief. And it has some of these symptoms, and it's not something, again, that you could just change your mood or change your opinion about things on your own. So it's a feeling of hopelessness, a lack of concentration, fatigue, worthlessness, those kinds of things. Anxiety is another common one. Again, if you have a big meeting coming up, of course you're going to be anxious. If you have to give a talk in front of 100 people, of course you're going to be anxious. But usually those kinds of anxiety, you can quote unquote turn them off on your own. But with a kind of clinical anxiety, it overlaps often with depression. That's why I'm talking a lot about these two today. But with other disorders, there's lots of other things that can come up, but sometimes they can overlap. But the general idea with anxiety is that you cannot turn off the worry. You cannot find something else to start thinking about. It's just a nonstop kind of fear that you can't turn off. And there's different kinds of anxiety, whether it's related to a trauma incident or whether it's related to just a general anxiety and worry that you can't turn off. Or some people may even have a panic disorder where they have physical symptoms that come along with their anxiety. Their heart races, they may start sweating, they might get dizzy, they may even faint. So there's some physical symptoms. And the important reason to take care of this is all the way back in 1967, one of the first connections between health and mental health was made when a group of psychiatrists looked at 5,000 patients and examined some stressors that they had going on in their life and scored those stressors based on how stressful that event was. So the highest stressor is the death of a spouse. And all the way down to a change of a habit or a change of a life event or something like that. And they scored these individuals based on how many stressors they had had in the last year of their life. And they found that people that scored 300 or higher had at least one risk of a severe illness in a certain given time. So there's a strong connection between physical stressors and mental health. And physical health. And this is why we need to get a handle on it and maybe use a different tool to help us to thrive more so it doesn't affect our mental and our physical health. So even if somebody has less than 150 on this scale, they still found a slight risk of illness. So even a small amount of stress can create physical illness as well. So it's really important to rein in our stress and figure out healthy ways to deal with it. And so that comes from a multidimensional perspective. We can't just say, okay, I'm going to fix somebody's financial issues and now everything is wonderful. Or I'm going to fix their health issues and now everything is wonderful. We have to look at people from a multidimensional kind of balance. We have to balance their physicality, their emotions, their mental health, and their spiritual health. And somewhere in the middle of all 4 of those circles, then we can get a group of people that are healthy, both mentally and physically, and from all areas of their life. So anyone can have a threat to wellness, the research shows us. And that threat to wellness can be something that is transient, that just passes by for a couple weeks. Hopefully COVID is a transient stressor, even though it's been really stressful. Or it can be something really chronic, like a chronic illness or a chronic financial problem or something like that. But our stressors can be chronic or they can be transient. Either way, we need to find a way to be resilient to our stressors. And we can do that through spirituality, through balancing this wellness wheel. I believe there's 8 things here. And when we balance all of these different areas, then we tend to be the most mentally healthy that we can be. And we find that if people have one of them that is less balanced than the other, and we try to bring that back into balance, then we'll do better as well. So try to have this balance between all of these areas in our lives. And then if we do that, then we can move from carrying the weight of the world on our shoulders to being more resilient, which I'll talk more about today. The interesting thing is that when we have something good in our lives, we usually anticipate and plan for it. Think about when you're planning for a wedding, or you're planning for a new job, or you're planning for a baby. We have baby showers, we have bridal showers, we plan our weddings for about a year or so before. We prep ourselves before an interview for weeks or even a few days or something. And we always prep for the good that comes in our life. But when we're approaching a roadblock or a problem, then we're scrambling and trying to adapt to that problem. So we're not prepared before that problem occurs. And that's part of the problem. We need to figure out a way to be using our positive psychology skills before the problem happens, not as it's happening, because then we're not thinking clearly. Think of like a fire drill that they have in schools for kids. They do the fire drills before there's a fire. So you know where the exits are and you know how to get out of the building quickly. We need to be anticipating of those difficult times before they happen. And if we're a Christian, we know that there's tribulation in the world. Even Christ said, I have told you these things that you may have peace. In the world, you will have tribulation, you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So what do you do when a challenge hits? Do you break or do you bend? And we have seen that if you have a tree and the tree bends, then it's not easily broken. But if it toughens up and it's rigid, that tree will break. So it has to be something that is flexible to be able to move in tough times. And so in tough times, we are either reshaped or we are broken. And so hopefully the purpose of today's talk is to help us figure out how we can reshape ourselves during times of difficulty. And research has shown us that when people encounter something difficult, they either fall apart and succumb to that problem and their functioning is impaired. They can survive and continue to function with or without some sort of impairment. They could fall below baseline and then rise back up to baseline and stay there. But hopefully, if we're resilient, we kind of thrive and go beyond our original level of functioning and go above and beyond where we were before. And so resilience research has also shows us acts like a chain reaction. So once the positivity starts, it's a chain reaction that keeps snowballing more and more and more and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So we really want to get motivated to get that resilience going. And not all resilience is something that we can do. Some of it's partly biological or the circumstances that we're in. But for the most part, if we apply some of these positive psychology tools we'll talk about today, then we'll get to a place where resilience is kind of like a chain reaction. So again, we want to focus on wellness. Think about for yourself, these are rhetorical questions. You can answer them later on if you like, but think about some of the difficulties that you're facing right now. Do you blame anyone for your problems? There's a concept in resilience that says when we focus on facing ourselves and facing our problems and facing and saying, you know, what can I do to change this, as opposed to blaming everybody else, we tend to do better. The word for that is locus of control. But think about what purposes there may be behind this. What is the hardship that we're facing? What meaning can I make out of it? Is there a spiritual reason behind it? And what lessons have I learned from this situation or from this hardship? Even if I can't pull anything good out of it, what have I learned? And that can be something significant for us as well. Think about a situation, a problem that you've gone through in the past, or even now with COVID. Do you see that problem as a challenge, or do you have a sense of despair? Do you have a sense of hopefulness, or do you feel discouraged? Do you get a sense of meaning out of that situation, or do you not get a sense of meaning? And do you respond in problem solving, or do you just give up? And do you feel you get stronger, or do you get weaker with adversity? And so again, if you feel challenged, if you feel hopeful, if you feel a sense of meaning, if you feel like you can problem solve and you get stronger, those are all individuals that can become resilient with time. And we'll talk about resilience. It's not this pie in the sky kind of idea that everything is wonderful. That's not it at all. It just means that you're trying to put some purpose into what's happening around you, even if you can't control it. And so think about this boiling pot of water as your stressor. You could be any one of these next three things: a carrot, an egg, or a coffee. Think about what happens if you put a carrot into the stressor, into a hot boiling pot of water. Eventually that carrot disintegrates, falls apart. So if that is our stressor and we fall apart, we're not accomplishing anything. If we become the egg in the hot water, that egg becomes hardened. It doesn't let anything in, it's hardened. So think of a person who becomes hardened by their stressors, mean, disrespectful, not kind to others. That is a person who's become hardened. The coffee, on the other hand, is the only one that changes its atmosphere, makes it more aromatic, makes it edible, makes it delicious. And so the coffee is the only one that changes its environment when it is in the stressor. In this example, we want to be the coffee to change our environment, to change ourselves for the better, not for the worse. And so when we think about things this way, we can think about treatment that we want to be involved in, treatment that reframes our thinking, or maybe sometimes even medication, but definitely social support, lifestyle changes probably for things that are no longer working, to minimize the stressors or to manage them at the very least, and to find some spiritual and psychological resilience along the way. And that's what we'll talk about for the rest of today's talk. So again, we want to talk about things from a biopsychosocial spiritual model and not just look at a person from one perspective or another. We have to be more balanced in how we look at things. And the biopsychosocial model before 1977, when George Engel came up with this model, people only looked at diseases. So they only wanted to fix a disease. You come in with a disease, say diabetes or a heart disease, and they just looked at that and that was it. But George Engel he was a psychiatrist in Rochester, New York. And he wanted to depart away from that traditional model of understanding of just looking at one disease piece, and that was it. So you have diabetes, we only look at the pancreas, and that's it. Instead, he wanted to look at biological factors, social factors, psychological factors, to look at the whole person and how that relates to a disease. So maybe we fix the diabetes, but this person has a lot of stress at home that, again, as far back as 67, we saw that everything contributes to health. Stressors contribute to health. So he wanted to take those things into consideration. So this biopsychosocial model started to formulate, and he didn't want to look anymore at just the cellular or the molecular or the disease structures, but at every counterpart that related to a disease. And so it helps us to look holistically at the whole person, to see how we can make them self-aware, to overcome their difficulties, helps them to see their relationship to their own well-being, their life circumstances to their well-being, and look at them from a holistic, multidimensional, biological, psychological, and social perspective so that we can promote overall health. So again, we're looking at body, mind, and spirit, and this contributes to resilience. And as we've done more research, we've seen that religion and spirituality in particular provide all of these great things towards our resilience. At the very least, it gives us a motivation to endure during difficulty and gives us resilience. It gives us guidelines and something to strive for. And some research has shown that there's a negative correlation. So as one increases, the other decreases. So as religion and spirituality increases, things like suicide, substance abuse, risky behaviors, and depression decrease. And there's an increase with religion and spirituality and things like mental and physical health. So again, all of these things are connected, and we cannot think of positive psychology without thinking about holistically the person that we're looking at. I won't go too much detail into this slide, but this is just another way of showing that adversity has both a spiritual, psychological, and biological perspective. From a spiritual perspective, adversity could be as a result of sin or being away from God, or because God is trying to show us a purpose of some sort. It could also be because of spirituality, psychologically or genetically. So there could be lots of different reasons why somebody has a sense of adversity. And if we only look at it from, say, a spiritual perspective, we'll say, oh, well, God's punishing this person. Or if we look at it only genetically, well, I can't do anything about it because their genetics gave them diabetes or whatever. So we have to look at the person from the whole perspective again, not just from one perspective, to look at adversity from multiple directions. And then once we've done all that, then we can overcome our difficulties with faith and with the power of our mind. And I'll talk about the power of the mind first, but it's important to acknowledge both, because as Christian people, we know that all things work together for good for those who love Christ and are called to his purpose, from Romans 8:28. But we also have a very powerful mind, and that's where resilience and positive psychology come in to help us navigate these difficult and stressful times. And the first thing we need to think about is what needs in our life are missing. So the very first needs is from, this is Maslow, who was a psychologist, who studied human qualities and trying to figure out where people's needs are, and when they're missing, what happens. And his ultimate goal was for us to get to the self-actualization piece, this blue piece at the top, which is the best person that we can be in terms of our morality, in terms of our creativity, in terms of our acceptance of facts, in terms of being the best people that we can be. However, we can't get to that blue top of the triangle unless we have all of the needs below it met. So imagine if you are in a war zone and you don't have any food or water and you can't sleep and your body functions are not done the way that they're supposed to. It's too hot or it's too cold. Of course, you can't think about self-actualizing. Or if you have a sense of safety issues where you don't have health or prosperity, you can't think about that blue at the top. After that, you need to meet needs of love and belonging. You need to have a feeling of family and belonging to friendships, and that I belong to somebody, that somebody loves me and cares about me, that I have a purpose for somebody here on earth. And then after that, I can move on to self-esteem. Then my self-esteem is good because I have all of the other previous needs met. And then I can be the best that I could be at the top of that triangle. But sometimes we try to go to that top of that triangle while we're still missing something from the bottom four. And so if you have a need in your life that is missing from the bottom four, I encourage you to try to get that need met first before you try to be the best person that you can be. And so to harness the power of mind, the field of counseling psychology does this really well. And people often think of clinical psychologists that focus mostly on psychopathology, disease models, and looking back at people's childhoods and things like that. Whereas counseling psychologists tend to focus more on the strengths of an individual, on prevention, on the emotional side of the individual, helping them to adjust to difficulties in life, helping them to reframe their thinking, understanding the importance of a good vocational fit. If your work is not something that you're interested in or find meaning or purpose in, you're not going to be a person who's very happy. And so counseling psychologists, as opposed to clinical psychologists, are not looking at a disease model. We're looking more at prevention and how to help people to thrive and be the best that they can be. And we're also looking at social justice type components as well. So positive psychology kind of branches out from there, and that helps us to deal with really focus on strengths that allow people to build a meaningful and purposeful life. What allows people to not just survive day to day, but to flourish, to get to the top of that triangle, to be in that blue area, to be the best that they can be. We're trying to look at life satisfaction and well-being, and we're not just looking at fleeting happiness, but a very deep sense of joy and wellness. And that's where it's very much a field that is related to spirituality. Spirituality often talks about joy. Our churches often talk about joy. It talks about it in the liturgies. It talks about it in the Bible. And so this sense of joy is not something that comes from, pleasurable activities or events that are happening, but a deep sense of peace and joy. And that's where positive psychology is the kind of study of scientific study of what the church talks about as well. So here's some examples of what all goes into this sense of positive psychology, from positive purpose to gratitude, to being mindful, to having good experiences and knowledge of self, to having a positive release, and to feel a social connection to others. So there's some models of wellness that we want to focus on based on positive psychology. And one of the founders of positive psychology came up with this PERMA V model that says we have to, in order to have wellness, we have to have a lot of positive emotions. And this is the right balance between resilience and understanding that sometimes there are stressors in life. We have to have a sense of engagement, really good interest in what we're doing, and not just floating through life and passing time, but something that we're deeply invested in and engaged in. We also have to have good, healthy relationships that help us to thrive, help us to grow, help us to see the best part of ourselves and to enhance those. We have to have a sense of purpose and meaning, and again, in what we're doing. We have to have a sense of achievement, that I accomplished something, whether it's family members, whether it's a job, whether it's a career, but I have to feel like I have a sense of purpose and a sense of achievement. And finally, vitality. This is the newer one. It used to be just PERMA. Now it's PERMA V. The research has shown us now we should add V to the end. But this is kind of the health aspect of it: eating well, sleeping enough, just feeling vibrant from a physical perspective as well. Another model of wellness is the Spire model. And the very first letter there is spiritual. Again, we have to have a spiritual connection to something in order to reach our greatest wellness. We also have to have good physicality, like we just said, eating well, sleeping well, exercising, good intellectual conversations, something that invigorates you mentally, basically. Relational, we just talked about that with PERMA. You have to have good relationships and good emotional health as well, cultivating positive emotions, powerful emotions. And research has shown that when people think positively, they expand their ability to think and to problem solve. So that sounds counterintuitive. We have something inside of us called a negativity bias, where we all lean a little bit towards the negative side. So a little bit of pessimism in all of us. And the reason for that is to help us. The brain thinks that if I think negative, then I will be able to solve a problem when I face it, because I've thought of the worst case scenario. But instead, research is showing something actually the opposite. The more positive emotions we have, the more we expand. It's called the broaden and build theory. The more we're able to expand our ability to think about a problem and to problem solve through that issue. So we want to have a good amount of positive emotions as well. So in terms of emotional intelligence, is somebody that can do this really well. Usually we think of somebody who's intelligent as someone that's really good at math or science, and they work for NASA and they're astronauts, and those are the people that are smart. When in fact, we have found that there are 7 to 8 kind of intelligences, not just mathematics and spatial and verbal, but things like movement can be a kind of science that shows us that we're intelligent. Being self-reflective, being interpersonal with other people, having a musical talent, and knowing and having some self-awareness, some self-regulation, some motivation to do the work that we need to do, empathy and understanding for other people's feelings, and lots of social skills are all forms of intelligence as well. So we can't just say that just because I don't work for NASA, that means I'm not intelligent. Research shows us there are multiple kinds of intelligences. Another part of positive psychology that we should focus on is engagement and flow. And there's research that shows that these lead to happiness as well. And again, that intense, deep joy, not just a fleeting happiness. So Sigmund Freud, one of the first psychotherapists, was once asked to define happiness. And he said it is work and love. Simply because love gives us a place in the world and somebody to belong to and somebody to care about. And work gives us a sense of purpose, that I'm investing in doing something. So meaningful, engaging work not only fuels us professionally, but it also contributes to our feelings of personal growth. And there's been research on a concept called flow that's listed here, where if you're ever doing something that is really super meaningful to you, and it's not necessarily just work, it could be just, outside working on your bike in a garage, or anything that you find meaningful, or you're reading a book or something like that. You get into a zone, and that zone is supposed to be one of the most meaningful experiences on earth, because nothing else matters but what you're doing that is so enjoyable and meaningful in that moment. And flow is neither good nor bad. It simply is. It is just helping us to lead a more full and invested and intense kind of joy and life experience. Another thing that we have to consider with positive psychology is the concept of character strengths. And you can go onto this website, viacharacter.org. I have no affiliation with this website, but it is a great website that will help you to understand what your personal character strengths are. They found that people across the world, regardless of culture, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of socioeconomic status, it didn't matter. We all have these 24 character strengths inside of us in a different constellation. Everybody has their own unique combination, as unique as your fingerprints. And that unique contribution that you have, if you contribute that to the world and you use that and lean on it, you can have a lot of sense of meaning and support for your life. So going to this website, you can take a short survey or a short quiz, and it'll list for you which ones are your highest, all the way to number 24 in terms of your character strengths. And again, the more that you lean onto those, the more meaningful experiences you have, the greatest joy you have, the greater happiness that you have, because you are leaning on something that is uniquely yours, a strength of yours, that nobody else in the world has that exact combination. So I encourage you to do that. And then all 24 of those are broken into one of 6 categories. So your highest could be categories of wisdom or courage or humanity or spirituality or transcendence or feelings of justice. or feelings of a sense of moderation and balance. You also want to remember that coping and thriving, sometimes we want to rush through that, but it's important to know that the final destination is not where you are today, because stress often makes us believe that things have to happen immediately, right now. But faith reassures us and hope reassures us that everything will happen when it's supposed to, according to God's timeline. So I want to spend some time now talking about resilience a little bit more, and make it known that adversity does exist. We're not minimizing the place of adversity in our life and what it causes us to do. The important thing to remember is that we can bounce back, kind of like a rubber band. A rubber band stretches across whatever you're trying to tie with the rubber band. And then as soon as you release that rubber band, it goes back to its original shape. So you can bounce back and be flexible. And that's what resilience really is. Resilience we think about it, is it a new concept? But historically, resilience has been talked about since the beginning of time. Since philosophers have said that our glory is not in falling, but in rising. A Japanese proverb, which is very similar to Proverbs 24:16, says that we fall down 7 times, but get up 8. We have Job here asking God about his troubles. Joseph experienced a lot of hardships. Naomi and Ruth experienced a lot of hardships. Esther could have died along with all her people. St. Paul was shipwrecked and beaten and thrown in prisons, and he still came out resilient. And so it's important to know that this great thing from Corinthians, it says we are not crushed, we are not in despair, we are not abandoned, we are not destroyed. And Christ said we should have peace because he has overcome the world. So this concept is really as old as time. We've even heard the saying of what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, by Nietzsche. And so this concept is not something new, but it's something that has been explained kind of by philosophers, by biblical texts, by spirituality, by all kinds of things. And again, these are the examples I just mentioned of biblical characters that experience adversity. So this tells us that adversity is a very normal part of life. It has nothing to do with we're being punished or we're being told in some way. It's a normal part of life. And it's been around since biblical times. It does not mean that we're weak or that we're out of the grace of God. It does not mean that God is not with us during all this adversity. From those examples that I just mentioned, he was present during those adversities. It just means that resilience can come in, and it doesn't mean that adversity has to break us. So resilience is basically like this flower. It's the ability to kind of bloom and thrive and be the best that you can be, even in the midst of something arid and has no nutrients and has no growth. You can still grow. Resilience is actually quite complex. And if we were to study this from a scientific perspective, it would look kind of like this. This is a model I published several years ago that discusses resilience. So it can be quite complex, but basically it's the ability for us to succeed successfully, even through challenging situations. And as I said a few minutes ago, it does not mean that we're ignoring the difficulty. It's not the absence of difficulty. It's the ability to have a conscious choice that we have this experience of full spectrum of human emotions, but it does not consume us. We can still thrive. It does not have to consume us. And we can say it is really difficult right now during COVID, but I get to spend more time with my family, but I get to read, some more books that I wanted to read, or I'm going through a tough time during this quarantine and I'm able to work around the house a little bit more and maybe fix some things up. So it's the ability to hold both things in our mind. That is what a resilient person can do. The American Psychological Association put together a task force many years ago that said that resilient people are able to make connections. They don't see every crisis as insurmountable. They can accept that change is part of living and that they should move towards goals decisively. They always look for opportunities of self-discovery. They can nurture a positive self-view about themselves. They can keep things in perspective and have a hopeful outlook and still take self-care into consideration. And that is what makes a person resilient. It isn't the absence of stress. It isn't the absence of difficulty. And research has also shown us that every person that has survived up until this point has gone through some sort of stressor. So some research has shown that if we look back at our own personal history, our own personal story, and reflect and deconstruct other times where we had difficult situations that were similar, or maybe not even similar, but had a traumatic component to them, then we can get to the root of what is distressing us, and we can pay attention to how we escaped out of that difficult time, out of that stressful time. And if we can look for a pattern in our own history of how we've overcome our vulnerabilities, maybe we can use that in our current situation. So maybe I turned to family, or maybe I turned to church and my faith more, or maybe I ate better, or maybe I slept more and that got me through the stressor, or maybe I planned better and that got me through the stressor. So then maybe I can use those same kind of tools to help me to cope with the current situation that I'm in. So again, you're deconstructing your own story. You're looking for corroborating evidence, maybe from family or friends, and you're using your own story to kind of inoculate yourself, if you will, towards this current stressor. And then you're tailor making and brainstorming different ways to get out of this problem that you're in right now. And by tailor making, I mean, it may not work for your brother or sister or your parent or your friend or your spouse, but it works for you because it is your personal story applied to this current situation. And so again, if we can anticipate in some way and look to the past a little bit and look to the future with goals, we can come up with a solution for our current problem. Research also tells us that there are characteristics that we can enhance to prevent ourselves from falling away from resilience. If we enhance our self-esteem, we can increase our resilience because resilience tends to enhance self-esteem, but people with lower self-esteem tend to see situations as more stressful. Some people like to run and hide from a problem, like this guy that's putting his head in the sand. An ostrich does that too. If I put my head in the sand, then the problem will go away. It usually doesn't go away. It usually comes back with a vengeance and much bigger. So people that face the problem head on, as scary as it is and as uncomfortable as it is, those are the individuals that tend to be more resilient. Because the more that you face those problems, the greater ability that you have and competence and mastery over that difficulty, which gives you solutions to stressors and makes you more resilient. Also, if you have social support, like I said, that builds resilience as well. If you can't find social support, find a community group or something to engage in to increase your social support. Some people may tend to feel a sense of guilt and self-blame. We also want to increase resilience there and use the guilt as a lessons learned tool as opposed to wallowing in that guilt forever. I have clients sometimes that come in that will sit on guilt for year after year after year, and it really, really weighs them down. Whereas if we learn, what did I learn from this situation? Or how can I forgive myself and move on, kind of thing. Those are the things that will help us to be more resilient. And again, we have in our church a tool for that, confession, unburdening my sins, unburdening my problems, unburdening what's difficult with me. And then I can move on from it there and find some solutions. We also want to increase a reframing of the events. Is it really as bad as I think it is? I work with clients all day long to reframe things and to put things into, and to not to spin it positively and just, fluff it up a little bit, but to genuinely see, is this a problem where I'm catastrophizing, or can I reframe it and look at it a different way? And again, if I'm thinking with positive emotions, research has shown, which I talked about a minute ago, that the ability to think and to problem solve increases the minute we're able to think more positively, because we're able to shift our thinking from what is negative to what I'm grateful for, or what is good, or anything like that. Again, if we focus on our strengths rather than focus on our weaknesses, then we can get out of adversity, and research has shown that as well. If we identify ourselves as survivors rather than victims, that doesn't mean that you didn't go through something really traumatic or really difficult, but if I identify myself as a survivor, then I have a sense of mastery and control over that situation. If you can't do it by yourself, you're not alone. It's important to talk to someone about your feelings to help you to sort them out. If you can't think about what you're so overwhelmed with emotion, you don't know what you're thinking about in terms of your emotions, at least start with these emotions. These are the primary colors, if you will, of the emotional wheel. So you can either be happy, fearful, sad, or angry. And when you combine all of those emotions in some way, you get all of the other colors of the rainbow of emotions. And once people have mastered these, then we can move on to these kinds of emotions, where people start in the center of the wheel and then branch out. But even as young as little kids, 3 and 4-year-olds, I use that chart with them on the left, and they can point out faces of what they feel and they can help themselves figure out what emotions they're feeling. And the reason we do that is that we can't control what's happening if we can't control our emotions. Somebody that you can talk to is supposed to be warm and genuine and can step in your shoes and understand what you're feeling, is someone who's consistent, not here today and gone tomorrow, and someone who's really patient with you and patient with the problem that you're facing. And so that's why therapists and psychologists are really good at doing those things, because they have these characteristics and the training to do that. But even if you're talking to a friend, these are the characteristics that they should have to help you to improve and to feel better. We also want to put things in perspective, that God is in control. We have to see things through God's lens, that he loves us and has a purpose for us, that he knows every pain, that he's molding us even through the pain. So sometimes we need to surrender and let go and let God, and that is the benefit of being a Christian on top of knowing these science-based principles. And of course, we have to be patient. Sometimes we want things now, but it doesn't work that way always. Sometimes we just need to let things unfold and work themselves out, and not overly stress about them happening immediately. Back to this God is in control. We know that the same God that controls the planets is the same God that controls something as small as a hummingbird. Remember the gospel verses that tell us that the very hairs of our heads are numbered. So we have to be patient and persevere and let God handle it. Again, stop the negative thoughts, because our thoughts are so powerful. And you would never think that your negative thoughts are affecting things, but they really are. And research supports that notion that the more positive thoughts that we have, the more we'll be able to problem solve. We also want to practice gratitude. There's a lot of research on gratitude that shows that when we're thankful for even a few things during the day, we shift our thinking from what is negative into what is positive. It's a kind of a purposeful turning your car towards the direction of positivity and gratitude. And interestingly enough, our church uses the Thanksgiving prayer in every event, whether it's a funeral, a wedding, a baptism, it doesn't matter. And so the church has this perspective of we can be gracious and have gratitude in every circumstance, in all things, even things that are difficult. And science now supports that as well. Research has also shown that people that help others tend to do better. It's actually an endorphin boost and an emotional boost when we help other people. And it can go from something as small as holding the door open for them to helping out at a charity or at a soup kitchen or something like that. Those activities have shown with research that they lower the stress hormones of cortisol and increase the good hormones of things like dopamine and serotonin, and give us a boost to make us feel better as well. So we're helping others and helping ourselves in the process. Again, apply your own story of resilience from your own past. Here are some positive emotions that you can focus on if you're wondering what are some of the positive emotions. Again, gratitude, joy. And joy is not based on circumstance. Joy is just, what are the fruits of the spirit, and something that we can cultivate as well. Hope, a sense of pride in ourselves, a sense of awe. A sense of awe can come from nature. I heard a couple people at the beginning talk about taking walks or taking a bike ride. And those things are really good for positive emotions as well, because you can look at nature and be in awe of those things, and it can increase resilience that way. Coping is being able to deal with our stressors, brainstorming, problem solving, being adaptive in some way. Can be something in the short term or something in the long term. And we can use faith and rely on God to help us during this process as well. We have to know that every single lock has a key, and it's a matter of just trying to figure out where that key is. But it takes, again, patience and courage and passion to help us to figure out how to solve a different kind of problem. And if you can't do anything and you're feeling overwhelmed or sad or angry or whatever it is, take a baby step, one small thing. I have a client, for example, right now that is an artist and is feeling some artist block, if you will, similar to writer's block. And so we're working on something just very small. Just get your supplies together today. That's all you have to do. Get your pencils, your erasers together, your pads that you're going to be drawing in, the colors that you're going to use to shade. And that's all you have to do today. And then maybe draw just a sketch. It doesn't have to be perfect. So small baby steps can give you a sense of confidence and a little bit of a boost to help you as well. You want to use positive coping mechanisms. Here are some examples: meditating, praying, talking with family and friends, talking with a counselor or a priest, journaling, art, music, being assertive, which means firm but not aggressive. And the most important one probably on this list is solving your problems as they come. Some people have a tendency to stuff it down, to stuff it down, to stuff it down. And then just like a volcano that's brewing and brewing and brewing, and with time, and then all of a sudden that volcano explodes. So the pressure release valve of that should be that you take the problems as they come and solve them as they come. Exercise and walking. Nature is a great stress reliever. Counting to 10 before reacting. Learning the simple assertive thing of saying no. If you're overwhelmed, it's okay to say no. Don't be rude about it, but you can say no and say it in a polite and assertive way, and say, I just don't have the time right now, or I can't do it right now, because your self-care is really important. And it's a very important part of our self-care and our positive psychology. Some negative defense mechanisms are not being able to control our emotions, having poor self-esteem, running and hiding, again, like this guy who puts his head in the sand, withdrawing away from other people and not getting help, and then doing these negative defense mechanisms like displacing our anger on other people or having a projection of our emotions onto somebody else. I'm not angry, you're the one who's angry. Or I'm angry about this situation, so I'm going to say that everybody else has the problem, not me. Or being in denial, or rationalizing something rather than facing it and dealing with it. And so using these negative coping mechanisms is just kicking the can down the road, as they say. You're going to encounter that problem again, and it's going to be bigger and uglier than it was before. So it's better to just deal with it with positive psychology and positive coping mechanisms than to let it sit and fester. So again, to summarize kind of all of this, again, we want to express gratitude. Research shows that even listing 3 big or small things throughout the day that you're grateful for can really boost your mood and can shift your thinking away from what is negative towards what is positive. Savoring is a great thing. I think more of us should do this. We're always, maybe not necessarily during COVID, but even before COVID, people were always rushing through everything, rushing through their morning breakfast, rushing through their coffee, rushing through conversations, always rushing, running. But savoring is actually something where you sit and be mindful of exactly what you're doing. If you're having a conversation, focus on every word that you're involved in it with that conversation. If it's with a family member or a friend, if you're enjoying a good meal, savor it. Think about all the flavors that you're experiencing. Find good experiences in every day and sit and focus on them really intently. And again, research with this shows that when we do that, we kind of bank in our mind these positive experiences and withdraw from them during times of negativity or times of difficulty. So savoring is really important. We need to do that more often. Stop and smell the roses, as they say. Positive emotions, again, are really important to build our mood and to help us to problem solve more clearly, examine your story of resilience, and also be altruistic to others. From a spiritual perspective, we want to focus on determining our goals, focus on what's not working and either fix it or remove it. Don't be complacent. That's where you just sit and do nothing. And that's when kind of problems start to creep in. We want to be action oriented. That doesn't mean, I'm not saying don't rest. Of course we need to rest. I'm saying we need to be action oriented, because when people are complacent, they have no goals and they tend to get depressed. So of course, take time to rest, take time to vacation, but be action oriented in your everyday life as well. Be balanced. Don't let one area dominate over another, like not let work dominate over spirituality or over family. Be balanced in all areas. Accept a situation as a challenge. Know that it will pass eventually. You know, Pope Shenouda used to say that the problem is temporary, and that God is present, and that all things work for good, right? So we have to accept that challenge is sometimes part of life, but that it's temporary and it will go away and something else will replace it. Sometimes we need to let go and let God figure out how to solve this. Practice gratitude, small steps. Of course, do not give up, and of course, pray. So again, at this point, you need to have resilience in all fronts. Those 4 circles, again, that we talked about initially: physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. I really want to talk briefly about grit and perseverance. Grit is, you can break down the word grit into guts, resilience, initiative, and tenacity. It's the ability to stick with a goal that you truly, truly believe in. But sometimes we also need to learn how to let go. So sometimes people have this tenacity and they just hold on for dear life, but this thing is not working. And we have to realize when to hold on, because this is my dream, this is my goal, this is my ultimate purpose, and when to let go because this is not your dream, this is not your ultimate purpose, this is not meant to help you or to heal you in some way. So there's a two-edged kind of sword here. You have to learn when to let go and when to hold on and persevere. And I also want to touch on this last couple slides here on hope and optimism versus toxic positivity. Toxic positivity is where you're in denial or minimizing or invalidating someone's negative experience in order to stay hopeful and positive. So if somebody's going through a really, really, really rough time, they have a family member in the hospital who's really ill, and you say, oh, it's okay, you know, God will heal them. And you're completely ignored the stress that they're going through, or somebody lost their job and now they're really struggling to make ends meet. And you're saying, oh, it's okay, you'll find another job. You've completely minimized their experience and their difficulty. And there's a verse in the Bible that kind of talks about this, where you say to someone, go eat and drink and be covered, and you're not helping them to find housing or shelter or food. And that's kind of the toxic positivity, because the Bible tells us to work as well to help others. Whereas hope and optimism is a little bit different. They're kind of, again, two sides of the same coin, where hope and optimism is very goal-directed. You're clearly thinking, you have a way to get to your goal. You've developed a specific strategy and you're working towards that strategy. So hope lets me see what's not here yet, but because I kind of have a plan to get there and a plan that enhances my well-being over time. It's a motivational factor. So I know the Bible talks about the substance of things not seen yet through Hebrews 11:1. But it's a goal that I may have, and I'm hoping for it, and I'm working towards it, but it's not here yet, as opposed to someone who's going through a problem and I'm completely minimizing it and just saying, oh, all will be well. Okay, so that's the difference there. And as I come to conclusion here, I absolutely love this painting by a Belgian artist from Belgium. And I really love this painting because it kind of encapsulates all of what we thought about today. That a person is looking at an egg and is hopeful and drawing a full functioning flying bird, not just a sitting bird, but a bird at its full potential. And he can see all of that just by staring at this egg. So this is really what positive psychology is. It isn't that I want the egg to move faster. It isn't that I want the egg to hatch and the bird to fly right now. It's that we have kind of a hope for the future. And we can do that by working towards it, by looking at our thoughts, by looking at our words, by looking at our actions, our habits, because all of that together become our character. And so that's what's really important about this painting. It kind of sums up everything, that somebody can be resilient and looking at a full functioning bird just by looking at an egg. And if somebody is broken, it doesn't mean that you're broken. It just means that's where, again, to kind of reframe it. We're not minimizing the brokenness. We're not minimizing the pain, but think of it as that's the place that light can enter. And it's a place where you can start to shift perspective, to start over again, to begin anew. And that's what's really important. You're not just broken, but those are experiences that you've kind of learned from, you grew from, and that's what we'll use to move forward. And this is a very nice artistic thing that they do in Japan, where they take pottery that's been broken and they don't throw it away. And they don't say, this is broken, it's done, it's useless. They actually fix it with gold. They glue the pieces back together with gold so that the person is stronger and more beautiful in the broken parts than they were before. So I often have this picture in my office to show people that just because you're quote unquote broken, it just means that this is the light where the light can enter, and that you can be even more beautiful in the broken spots and even stronger than you were before. And finally, we have to remember that we're not alone. When people are in distress, they often feel like they're alone. They want to separate from people, but we are not alone. Alone, you are just one drop. If you combine with other people, you become an ocean. So you're not alone. Make connections, solve problems together, get therapy, talk to your priest, talk to servants around you that you know, but don't do it alone. We're all in this together. And these resources are in the US, but you probably have some similar things in Canada where you are. The one that I talked about before about figuring out your character strength is on here as well, via characterstrength.org. The American Psychological Association and the APA Help Center have a lot of great articles that you can read about a lot of different topics related to mental health. And then there's some COVID resources there. All these resources are again here at my website or at my email. So feel free to reach out. There's also a phone number there if you'd rather talk in person. Thank you so very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Christine. I loved the presentation. It was so rich. I was just typing in away with so many different notes. We do have a lot of questions coming in.
Sure.
So
Should I stop sharing or leave the screen up so they can have the contact
if you
info?
could kindly keep it up so that everyone
Okay.
can have your contact info. Thank you so much for asking.
Of course.
Yeah, that was definitely useful.
Mhm.
So if everyone can go into the chat window, there is a link with the questions. I do see there's a lot of questions so far, but just so everyone would know about, because it is by voting, so I'm going to go from the top to the bottom. So the first question is, what is a good way to start setting healthy boundaries without feeling guilty or selfish?
That's a great question. And boundaries are so key to having healthy relationships. Because if people are stepping over your boundaries, you're going to get depressed, you're going to get anxious, you're going to get angry because your boundaries are not met. It's really important to know what your needs are initially so that you can set the appropriate boundaries. Sometimes there are things that you can compromise on, and other times there are things that are completely against your values, against your belief system, against whatever, and that should be a hard boundary. So you have to know for yourself, is this something I'm willing to compromise on, or is it something that I'm not willing to compromise on? That's the first step. You also have to know what need is not being met if this boundary is not met. Again, because if that boundary is overstepped on, you're not going to be able to have a functional relationship with this person. It's just going to lead to anger. And then when you state your boundary, as long as you're saying it assertively, there's 3 modes of communication. A person can be really passive and just get stepped all over, and whatever another person says goes. That's going to lead to resentment and anger. The other end of that spectrum is aggressiveness. Aggressiveness is where I only care about my needs. I'm really selfish, and I'm going to do what I say, and it doesn't matter what anybody else wants, and I can be really rude and disrespectful, and that's all that matters too. So that's not a great way of communicating either. You need to find the middle ground, which is assertiveness. And assertiveness is my ability to be firm and be, stating exactly what I want, but in a respectful, kind tone. So you're stating more factually as opposed to attacking another person, either verbally or physically. And that's the way to kind of assert your boundaries and say, this is what I need. Sometimes in therapy, we tell people to turn the focus onto you emotionally. And you say, when this happens, I feel this, as opposed to making the other person defensive and say, you did this to me and blah, 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 and pointing the finger and all that. And that puts that person's walls up. Everybody gets defensive. Everybody gets angry. So if you say it more from an emotional perspective, I feel this when this happens, it de-escalates the situation a bit.
I love that. I also really like the fact that you mentioned about be assertive, but be respectful in a kind tone, because I often find people have a very fine line of what assertiveness and aggression is.
Yeah.
So I really love the fact that you've mentioned that.
Mhm.
And the other key point that I just want to make sure, so to turn back the emotion on yourself. So you said that I feel this when this happens. Is that correct? Okay.
Yep.
Make sure everyone's clear on
It's
that.
it's an I statement because it hopefully makes the recipient is receptive to understanding that your emotional needs are important here. And if they're an empathetic person, sometimes there's individuals that have, personality disorders that make them not so empathetic, but hopefully most people are empathetic. And if you say, this makes me sad, this makes me hurt, this makes me whatever, that signals to the other person that I need this addressed so that I don't feel this way anymore. And hopefully an empathetic person will use that and say, okay, let me readjust and figure out how to fix this. But like I said, some people are with, some certain disorders are unable to be empathetic. So be careful of that too. So that you don't feel your need isn't being met.
Got it. Thank you. Hopefully that answers that question, which is really cool because it gets into the second one here. which you mentioned is, would you be able to explain how the locus
of control.
if it helps us in resilience, if at all?
Yes. So instead of, I'll give you an example with children. This is a really great one. So a child doesn't study for an exam and bombs the test and comes back and says, well, the teacher didn't teach me correctly. And my mom didn't help me go over it. And, I forgot, my teacher didn't tell me to take my book home that day. So that person's not accountable to their own actions. They're not accountable to saying, how can I fix this? Instead of saying, you know what, I admit I didn't study hard for this test. That's why I bombed it. I got a really bad grade, but here's what I'm going to do next time. I'm going to take notes. I'm going to get tutoring. I'm going to talk to my teacher. I'm going to study really hard. And now I'm going to ace this test. So when you put the accountability on somebody else, you never improve. That's not to say that sometimes people are not to blame. Yes, other people may be to blame. But if we're always putting the blame on somebody else and not being accountable for their own actions, that's not going to solve the problem. Again, we can do that scientifically, and there's scientific proof of what I just said. But from a spiritual perspective, that's why we have confession. It makes you accountable.
Got it. I love the fact that there is that association between locus of focus and accountability.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, locus of control, internal locus of control makes people more resilient because they focus on the problem within themselves and try to change and fix it.
And on the note of focusing on a problem and fixing it, the next question is on the fact that how do we suggest to help friends or family members who have been avoiding and numbing those adversities, such as, for instance, death of a loved one? So what do we do in this case?
Yeah, initially denial can be adaptive because the emotional, especially if you looked on that chart with the Holmes and Rahi, the death of a spouse or the death of a close loved one, probably a spouse, a parent, and a child is the hardest stressors that any human would face. So one of those three. So initially, because of the intensity of that emotion and how difficult it is, denial can be really adaptive because you're not breaking down because you're only thinking about this. But eventually, slowly, they're going to have to start to face that problem. And it can be in baby steps. It can be in putting one foot in front of the other, maybe getting them to go to church more or some community activity or getting them out of the house. I know you guys are under lockdown, but I'm just speaking generally. Just the baby steps can help that person to start to cope a little bit better. But initially, like I said, denial could be the coping mechanism as long as that doesn't become the only or the permanent coping mechanism.
Got it. Thank you.
It just prevents you from shutting down, basically. So initially it's okay, just not long-term.
Okay, got it. And speaking of breaking down in long-term, the next one is personally, how can we personally heal our old wounds and deal with current and past living stigma?
Okay. Yeah, old wounds is a tough one because subconsciously something can continue to affect somebody long after that trauma has left. And sometimes we work in patterns. So, that which we do not repair, we will repeat. So we have to find a way to repair it in order for us not to repeat it, because we will repeat it in patterns over and over and over again until we've learned our lesson. I hate to use that word of learned our lesson, but until we've resolved it in some way, it's going to continue to repeat. So if you can't do it on your own or you haven't figured out a way to break out of that pattern, therapy is great for that. Maybe initially even talking to your priest or your servant or whatever to help you with that. But it is really important to start to break patterns. Not everything that people say to you is correct, because you could just be in a toxic environment and all the people are saying the same thing. So you kind of have to decipher, is it a toxic environment and everybody's saying the same thing because they're toxic, or they all love me and they're saying the same thing because they want this particular thing to change. So it's important to figure out what the patterns is and figure out a way to get off of the merry-go-round. And whether that's asking for help to do so, or breaking a habit, or changing a pattern of thought, but somehow you have to get off the merry-go-round. And by merry-go-round, I mean, like I said, people will continue in patterns until they've resolved those patterns.
Got it. And just a step further for this question, if stigma is specifically on a social context, something happened and it's on a social context, how do we become more resilient in that perspective? I remember one of your slides saying that socializing helps with resilience.
Mhm.
If there's a stigma in that community or in that situation, what do we do at that point?
So we have different interests. We're not just in one bubble. So if that bubble is not working, find another bubble to get engaged in, to talk with, to speak about those kinds of things. We're not just glued to one entity permanently, you know? And so if that bubble is no longer working or stigmatizing against you in some way, whatever that way is, find another social group that will help you to, they will accept you. Not every single group has to accept you. But just keep trying until you find a group that will accept you.
Got it.
And not give up. And just know that you have, again, strengths. Lean on your strengths. We all have them. Those 24 are in each and every one of us. So at the very least, start there and use those to create a new social group.
Oh, I like that. I like how you mentioned where we can use the character strengths and actually see what understanding ourselves would help us like find the social group.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
The other question is, what is your comments on the version of Maslow's pyramid of needs that includes sexuality as an essential need? So I think it was back to that diagram that you had.
Yes, sexuality is definitely a need. It's on there. I think it may have been blocked in the initial slide, but sexuality definitely is one of the needs. As well, it's on the very bottom rung, along with food, shelter, and water. It's considered one of the needs.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, how do you go about finding? Oh, so I think this was mentioned. So, one person's just saying how they really love the talk, and they would like to read more about the content and presentation. And what are the books that you've written on these topics?
If you go to my website, I have a new publication that's coming out in a couple weeks. And all my old publications are there under publications, so you can go read some of those as well. One of the ones on women talks specifically about Coptic women. And there's a recent one on religion and spirituality, I think from 2018, on religion, spirituality, and resilience. And there's, like I said, another publication coming out here in a couple weeks, hopefully. So they're all on my website.
Thanks. So if you haven't been on her website, please do so as well. It's on the slide. There's two more questions here.
Sure.
So the one is, can you give an example of reframing in a situation where someone lost their job, can't pay their bills, have no prospective employment in the near future? This is like one of those high top ones that you've mentioned before. How do you do reframing in that sense?
Yeah, I have a great example for this, and I always use this example with this question because it's such an extreme example, but it's a beautiful example about how somebody can reframe. So early on in my training, maybe 15 years ago, I worked in a community in a college counseling center, so at a university. And I had a student that came in completely catastrophizing their first semester of college because they had failed a quiz. They failed one quiz, not a test, not a class, not a semester, one quiz. And in their mind, they had gone all the way to, I'm flunking out of school, I'm going to become homeless, my parents are going to stop paying for my classes, I'm going to lose my loans, I'll never find a job, and I'm not going to be able to, get married either. I mean, they really, really catastrophized. So we had to really reframe their thinking and slow them down and talk about the realism that they actually got into college. That's the first step. You must be smart enough. You got into college. And that was shocking to them, that I'm in college because I'm smart enough to be here. So after that, we had to, reframe their thinking to, again, this is just one quiz out of one class, out of one semester, out of one of the 4 years. So when you break it down like that and reframe to, okay, what can we do about this? And then this person said, I'm going to go to my professor and talk to them about what happened with this quiz. And what extra study material can I have? Or is there a, some sort of tutoring club that I can join where I can get some extra help? And maybe I'll talk to you as my therapist about how to manage stress during my test so that I'm not hyperventilating and panicking. So once we were able to do that, we've reframed all their thinking. They were not only able to pass that class, but they passed the next several years and graduated college just fine. So you have to be able to reframe your thinking. Again, your brain has a negativity bias that switches on and says, I'm going to think of the worst possible scenario so that I don't get there. But the opposite is what is actually better. Thinking positively, thinking about solutions creates more solutions and creates ability to think about that situation positively.
Got it. Another point that you mentioned in that, even to help with this question, is the way that you resolved that was that looking into like, how did you get to where you are now, which is
Right.
all positive,
Mm-hmm.
and then breaking it down into smaller bites. Whereas the example of the student, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to fail college. I'm not going to get married. I'm not going to do, and just like all bundled up. But then if you focus it compartmentalizing,
Yep.
like what can I do step forward? That's the way that you
That's
can
why
go
we
about
talked
it.
about baby steps.
Yes.
Never bite off more than you can chew. You really need baby steps. What can you do in this moment today? As soon as you leave this therapy office, what can you do to improve this situation? And that was, I'm going to go have a conversation with my advisor or with my professor. And that's all you have to do today. And then maybe get some extra tutoring books or something like that, but baby steps. Because if you try to overwhelm yourself, you're right back to where you started, being overwhelmed and frustrated.
Got it.
Baby steps.
I love that, especially how it relates back to that concept of flow,
Mm-hmm.
where like focus on one thing, you have that flowing go through as opposed to having all bundled up. Okay, that's quite insightful. Thank you.
Yeah.
And the last question that we have is, how does one go about finding out the best methods of coping outside of just trying them all? So I guess this person is just stuck here. What's the first thing that you do in those like baby steps?
You have to find what's meaningful to you, and what's meaningful to you is not what's meaningful to me. So what's meaningful to me as a coping mechanism, I said that right at the beginning of this call, is I didn't get out for my 10-minute walk today. In the spring, I walk a lot more. Even in the winter, when it's a snowstorm outside, I still try to get outside for 10 minutes. So for me, walking and being in nature is my way of coping. For you, it may be listening to music, or maybe journaling, or maybe artwork. I'm not an artist. I can barely draw a stick figure, so that's not going to calm me down. Okay. But walking will, journaling will. But what works for me is not necessarily what's going to work for you. So you have to find what is good for you. But, I have some clients that will draw and draw and draw and get into flow and bring in pictures and talk about the pictures that they drew in the sketches. And that's their relaxation. So whatever works for you, do that. Personally, for me, I'm a writer and I walk or bike.
That's quite amazing. And especially when you mentioned like, hey, you have things that are like outlets, like walking or writing.
Yep.
Myself, it's biking. So
Yep.
I think that even then, just having an activity that you can draw yourself into is also a really good coping mechanism.
Yep.
So forth. There is that one question that we have online, but it was answered at the beginning. It was like, what's a good way to start setting healthy boundaries without feeling guilty or selfish? That was answered. So if you like, you can check out the recording as well. And before we kind of wrap it up, just wanted to thank you so much again, Christine. This is like super insightful, super rich content here. And please, everyone, to check her out on her website. That's where all her books, her articles, blogs is all located there. And we're very hyped up for next week. We're going to continue the series of Crew and our pursuit to happiness. And next week is going to be the positive evening with Agora and our speakers from the Agora Ministries. And we're going to be going through that and having that type of positive mindset next week. So please join us then. And I guess we'll just conclude it into prayer. And if Amir, if you would like to pray for us, and we'll conclude it from there then.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for this wonderful evening. Thank you, God, for this wonderful fellowship. We thank you, God, so much for Christine's speaking to us and teaching about our pursuit of happiness, but also with a spiritual focus on it. And we thank you, God. We just want to remember that you are in the center of all things. Without you, we can't achieve anything. So help us always, God, to work on our relationship with you, spend time with you, and meditate. And we know that you are with us through every single difficult time. And we pray for everyone here today with their heads bowed. And we pray for everyone who is unable to attend at Crew. And we ask, God, that you hear us pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. In Christ Jesus our Lord. For thine is the kingdom, the power,